All right, so the question on hand is how to change resolution. Resolution is a little funky because the settings, you have four separate settings that are correlated with one another, and you sort of have to swap them in a funky little order in order to get them to behave. So anyway, this is our draft render that we're working with, but if you zoom in, you'll notice that the resolution is always going to stay fairly grainy. Like it'll render so that you get a good edge, but then when you zoom into that edge, it's still going to have a couple, pixels because of the size of it. The size of that image is based off of what you're seeing in your heads-up display. You'll see down the bottom, remember I explained this very early on when I was explaining all the tools, that it says film 35 by 35.45 times 24.00. So the resolution is the size of the image in pixels. So it's saying it's 1090 pixels by 738 pixels tall. Okay, does that make sense to all of you? Okay. So if I said that we needed a 10-inch image and I needed it at 150 dpi, how many pixels is that image in that dimension? Or 150 pixels per inch, dots per inch, pixels per inch. All right, it's a really simple mathematical equation. All it is how many inches by how many pixels per inch. So if I say it's 150 pixels per inch and it's 10 inches, it's 1500 pixels in that dimension. Does that make sense? No. Okay. So the thing that is going to throw you for a little bit of a loop here is film. Okay, film is a little confusing because it's measured, I think, typically in millimeters. But we kind of have to balance that with what we want for our image, but we need to balance it proportionally. All right, this is where it's going to get a little funky. So go to your camera settings in Maxwell. Notice how right now the yellow box for the heads-up display is around the entire view. Okay, that's because our output resolution down here is set to viewport. So when you scale or when you open up that menu, you're going to see that there are other options. Namely, we have something like 320 by 240, which will shrink the frame of the image to match that proportion. As you change those values, the proportion, I think these are all the same proportion actually. They don't change. But anyway, you can increase it as much as you want to a resolution that you see here in a standard proportion. See, now that one was a slightly different proportion. So what you need to know, though, is that as I switch from something like 1280 by 1024 to 1024 by 768, the output resolution will change the pixels there, but then you also notice one other thing will change: the size. Okay, so back up to the film back, and this is the part that Rhino becomes so physically accurate that it just makes it confusing. That they're trying to talk about this physical film in a digital world, which I really can't stand if you can't tell by now. But the proportions will change here. So the 30 just switched to a 32. So that's how you can kind of control what the proportions are of the frame on your page, and then you can modify what some of those what the pixels are associated with that. So I may have to do this twice because it depends which size you go first. But anyway, I'm going to switch this over to manual. And then what you can do here is change your size, your width, and your height. Okay, so it's always going to kind of be in this range. But if it's 32 wide and it's 24 tall now, let's think about what kind of image we might want to generate. If we want to generate an image that is, say, let's call it 4 inches by 8 inches, right? It's an odd resolution. We can very easily say that we want to go 8 inches wide by 4 inches tall. And that's going to make it really, really small. Oh, that just modified it. Oh, because the proportions are wrong. Right, so when I typed in 8 here and I switched over to that switched to 6, but if I go back to 4, that's going to switch back to 5.3. That's because the output resolution, yes?
It says millimeters, it doesn't matter.
It does say millimeters, and that's what I meant by like the film thing, how it is measured in millimeters, but you can think of it as inches in terms of its proportions, you know, however you want. You'll probably see it once we get it in place. But anyway, so you're looking at it just proportionally, 4 to 8. Doesn't matter if it's millimeters or inches, 4 to 8 is 4 to 8. So anyway, what you need to do is first think about the pixels. Okay, that's critical. So if we could start with something like, let's go to 400, and let's switch the width to 800. Oh, hang on. Go to viewport. Hang on a sec. So I forgot about this guy. So there's a little checkbox for lock film ratio. So as soon as you uncheck that, you have a little bit more freedom. So now I can change the 600 to 400, and it at least changes the box proportions. And then I can change, you know, frame size if I wanted to go up. So if I need this to be a 24, oh, sorry, I don't want to do that. Crap, you can't go back in that. That's right. Let's go back to 400 here. What are you doing? 400. Then you want to lock the film ratio and start to increase this to the size that you want. So you can actually just drag this up and down if you'd like. Okay, so it's going to do some funky things sometimes. If you need to increase the size again, let's say we actually need it to be 4,000 by 8,000, then you can just change the value in there. Does that make sense? So first you have to set the frame proportions, then you have to scale it to how you want it to fit in your frame. Does that make sense? It's a little funky because if you try to scale it so it fits in your frame first and then you try to change the proportions, it's going to get a little screwy on you. Any questions about that? So now you've got an image, like if this was 100, if the printer was printing at 100 pixels per inch, which is rather low, but for all intents and purposes, this would be a 40-inch by 80-inch rendering. Does that make sense? All right, you're all going to ask me a question about this at some point, I promise you. It's the one thing that locks everyone up at some point because it does really funny things if you don't do it in that particular order. You have to first change the proportions that you want in the film. Then you have to go into the size and change the size. Okay. All right.